The Nick and Pete Show.
The Nick and Pete Show.
Hello guys, and thank you for tuning into the Nick and Pete Show. This is your host, Pete, and today we will be discussing about the conscription crisis. The conscription crisis was a political and a militaristic crisis that took place in Canada in 1917 during World War I. Unlike the start of World War I, when people volunteered to go to war, this was a time when any male over the age of 18 were forced into war. Let's welcome our other host, Nick.
Hello guys, this is Nick and I'll give you a bit of background information that led up to the conscription crisis. On August 4th, 1914, Britain declared war on Germany. The message was delivered quickly across the Atlantic to Canada. Canada was automatically at war with Germany too. By October 14th, 1914, over 31,000 men who volunteered for war were transported across the Atlantic to England. Many men volunteered to go to war because of patriotism. They felt loyal and proud to fight for their own country. Canadians fought in many battles such as Ypres and Passchendaele and Vimy Ridge. In some of their battles, Canadians were led by British generals such as Douglas Haig. Over 2 million people troops from Triple Entente died in battles led by Haig. Haig stayed in the back of the trenches and forced the soldiers to go over the top, or else the soldiers would be shot to death by his own general. This was a very ineffective plan. The mortality rate was high and their rate of accomplishments were very low. By June 1917, Canada recruited more than 432,000 volunteers. Less than 5% were French Canadians. Robert Borden, the Prime Minister of Canada at the time, discovered that there were more Australian soldiers compared to Canadian soldiers, even though that Canada had a bigger population.
The Battle of Somme took place during late August 1917. 30,000 Canadian soldiers were sent over the top in broad daylight. As a result, Canada had 24,029 casualties, and if not more, from the Battle of Somme. After this bloody battle, Canada was desperate for soldiers, as there was not enough men who volunteered to replace the wounded and dead from the Battle of Somme. First, Borden started a volunteering campaign to make up for the dead soldiers. This plan did not succeed. It actually failed miserably. Here, I could sense jealousy coming from Borden that other smaller countries such as Australia had more volunteers. This led Borden to create a forced conscription system to replenish the Canadian Army. Additionally, Borden felt that this would be the only way to sustain the advantage.
So how did the Canadian citizens react to this?
Many English Canadians who were pacifists, union heads, or farmers opposed this idea, although often they could not make themselves heard. Let's take an example of a farming family. In the Mueller family, there are 7 members: Mrs. Mueller, Mr. Mueller, Frederick Mueller, who is 20, Tom Mueller, who is 19, and Patricia Mueller, who is 17, Joe Mueller, who is 15, and Grandpa Mueller. First of all, the Mueller family is a German family. There is a chance that they would not want to fight against the country of their origin, Germany. Moreover, the Mueller family would be on the British or Canadian side because Canada has given their family property. They are no longer living under financial pressure and they are assimilated into the Canadian culture. Next, if soldiers are forced into war, oh boy, that would be one lonely Mueller family. In that case, Mrs. Mueller, Patricia Mueller, and Joe Mueller would be left at home. Oh right, and Grandpa Mueller. Joe would be the only one on the farm, with occasional help from Patricia and Mrs. Mueller. That's right, 75% of their employees on that farm will be gone at war. Less crops, emptier tummies, and lower revenues. That's a no to conscription for sure. Oh, and Grandpa Mueller would have to wait a few days before Joe isn't busy to fix Grandpa's hammock. Finally, it has been 3 years since the start of the war. For sure, the Mueller family would know about trench living conditions and casualties. As much as the Canadian government has attempted to censor the reality at war, injured soldiers that return home must have spread the word. And don't even get me started on the feelings from French Canadians.
Right. Adding to that, Borden introduced the Military Service Act in May 1917, and the bill was passed in August 1917. This meant that Borden could conscript soldiers when needed. Many Canadians disapproved of this, especially the French Canadians. Quebec and the Prairie provinces had the lowest support.
Borden wanted to remain in power after the election of 1917 in Canada to ensure the stability of the conscription system. Borden allowed overseas soldiers and women who were nurses to vote. This was a witty idea because soldiers and nurses would love to have a bigger army alongside with them to ensure a quicker and a better chance of winning. Thus, they would support Borden and be in favor of his idea. Furthermore, the Wartime Elections Act was also passed. This allowed women that were related to soldiers and nurses overseas to vote too.
Borden won the election, securing 153 seats, compared to Laurier, who only had 82 seats. Had the Wartime Elections Act not been passed, Borden would have been short on approximately 100,000 votes. On January 1918, the Wartime Measures Act was once more enforced. The conscription crisis has caused a riot to break out from a protest during the Easter weekend in Quebec City. There were over 150 casualties, and the destruction damage have totaled up to $300,000. In March 1918, there was an urgent need for reinforcements after the Germans launched a number of victorious offensives on the Triple Entente. Borden's ministers were called in during the April 1918 and eliminated all exemptions. Canada emerged deeply from this crisis.
The Wartime Measures Act allowed the possibility of 404,000 men to be conscripted. 385,000 men found a way to be exempted. Later on, in the spring of 1918, the government did not allow exemption. 125,000 men were conscripted, and only 25,000 men were actually sent to the front. Fortunately for Borden, the war ended within few months.
Borden later retired in 1920. The conscription crisis left Canadians in distrust of their government. Borden's successor, Arthur Maine, also lost the 1921 election. Virtually, the Conservatives were shut up from Quebec for the next 50 years.
Before we end our first episode of The Nick and Pete Show, many of you may be wondering about what would happen to those who did not want to participate in the war. Well, an appeal process would be made. Think of this as the Hunger Games, if you read the book. Tributes from each community would be sent to partake in military service. If a man refuses, he would have to hope that someone else will take his spot in the military service. If not, he would have to plead and convince the two judges, one appointed from the parliament and the other who is the senior county judge. If the judges feel that it was best for the man to stay home, such as a farmer for food production, then he would not be sent overseas. Otherwise, he would have to appeal, and perhaps he will be put into civil or military prison. Thank you for tuning into the Nick and Pete Show, and be sure to watch our next episode. Austria started World War I because it had no friends.
The Nick and Pete Show.